sanctions bill has gotten bogged down into a fundamental difference.
I believe that we're way too late now.
I am Hala Mahdy, a researcher and journalist. Since the beginning of my career, I have paid special attention to studying international sanctions, particularly economic ones, over the past decades. At first glance, the measure seems like a routine punitive tool against certain rogue states, their foreign policies, or individuals and companies involved with them. But it's not that simple. How is it that, despite all the massive Western sanctions, Russia has managed to endure for so many years, with its economy even continuing to grow? How has North Korea's ballistic missile industry not collapsed, or Iran's oil sectors continued to thrive until today? Did those sanctions play any role in deterring Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Gaddafi's Libya, or even Israel? I seek to investigate the real effectiveness of these measures after many years and billions of dollars spent on enforcing them. Are they truly an effective tool? And how is it that Western countries have not learned from the harsh lessons of the past, which seem to repeat themselves consistently? Before searching for the answers, I wanted to ask the right questions. And there was no one better than Maria Nizzero to help me with that.
Hi, Maria. See you soon. Bye.
Money is the game, power is the aim. City's gonna pay when they got nothing to lose. He's got nothing to lose. No, it's in too deep, soul to soul, and it wasn't cheap. He's got nothing to lose, still got nothing to lose.
How was your journey in?
Oh, it was nice, despite the football match and the delayed bus.
So I put the board together, actually.
Thank you so much. This is quite of an interesting one. Sanction evasion routes, I'm assuming here. Is it? Yes, probably.
So, I mean, Maria, if we were to delve into the definition of international sanctions, just for observers and researchers.
International sanctions, they are political and economic decisions that are taken against state, non-state actors, such as a terrorist organization or individuals even, who basically are currently threatening international peace and security. They're taken for several reasons, and they aim essentially to coerce or to compel, or according to some, to punish these entities or individuals or states for, as I said, threatening international security. They can basically be in many forms. It can be an asset freeze, it can be a travel ban, it can be arms embargo or trade restrictions, oil bans as well. So depending on what is the final purpose of the sanction, then you have either a state, so it's going to be an unilateral sanction, or an international organization such as the United Nations, and so it's going to be a multinational international sanction. They will decide what kind of sanctions to impose. So far we have many different regimes. We have against terrorist organizations, we have against countries such as you probably see the word Russia is popping up and I see it on the board, Iran as well. You have it against individuals who potentially have, I don't know, committed or supposedly committed human rights violations, or even are believed to be responsible for corruption. So as I said, they are varied. They can be geographic, so they can target a country, they can target a region, or they can be thematic, so they can target a specific illicit conduct such as corruption or human rights.
I mean, that's why it's interesting that you actually brought up Russia, because it does bring out
some questions regarding why do sanctions actually target the Eastern Bloc and rogue states, or what is termed as rogue states. But before we move on to this, I mean, can I offer you anything to drink?
Absolutely, we'll lost some water. Thank you.
Maybe I'll grab some. Perfect, let's grab a seat. I'll be right back.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
There we go.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of their association with the Eastern Bloc and rogue states,
it's just a general sort of idea. You know, you impose sanctions to, as I said, those actors that reportedly are threatening international peace and security. So if you look at the map, the countries that are currently engaging in conflicts, such as, for instance, Russia, they are obviously going to be the target of international sanctions, potential or unilateral sanctions in the case of Russia. Then you have other countries that have, been in war, at some point during the years and decided to just keep on acting beyond and or outside of the international community, such as North Korea, for example. From the 50s onwards, you have Iran, from 1979. We had a little bit of a break in the 2010s, but then, we're back at it again. And then you have terrorist organizations, they are engaging, for instance, in illicit acts and obviously in human rights violations and so forth. And they are mostly located in areas where we could say that sovereignty is a little bit unstable, there. So wherever all those places where there is limited territorial control, it's probably more likely that you're going to see sanctions.
I can think of an example of a failed state, for example. I mean, Iraq's Saddam Hussein has evaded sanctions for, an unlimited amount of years. And why have these sanctions, or why have these precautions to all of these states? Why have they not been as effective for the previous few years?
It is a fair point.
More than a few years.
More than a few years, I would say, probably in the case of Saddam Hussein. I mean, sanctions do not operate in a vacuum. Okay, so the way that you should see it is, first of all, sanctions are only as effective as if their implementation is enforced. So what happens is you can designate as many people as you want. Look at the case of the Russian oligarchs. We have loads of them. We have 200 or plus names. However, one thing is designating, one thing is putting the name on a list, and another thing is enforcing the asset freeze, the travel ban, the arms embargo, whatever you want. So those are two different parts. The first one is a political decision. The second one is something that is still prompted by political push, however, needs to act in concert with international partners, first. Second, it needs to have all that apparatus from a state that is constantly looking that they are being implemented. And so what happens that if I am, let's take the example of a sanctioned individual, most likely is going to be a fairly, rich individual, potentially, knows that the sanctions are coming. I am going to do everything I can to avoid the sanction itself. And that's when you have individuals who facilitate the circumvention of sanction or the evasion of sanctions. That's when they come into the conversation. So for many of these cases, for many of these regimes, what has happened, the sanctions regime, for what has happened is that there has been an immense number of people operating in parallel. While we had the countries trying to implement the sanctions, they had all these other apparatus of people trying to evade them. And this is constantly, a sort of game where one puts, let's say, a designation in place, the other person is going to try to find a loophole to avoid it.
I mean, that's quite interesting, because it seems to me that you're describing the notion or the increased phenomenon of middlemen within these so-called rogue states who assist these jurisdictions to evade these sanctions. And there have been increased reporting and research in relation to strategies related to the circumvention, let's call it, of sanctions. But what does it actually, what are the methods for the circumvention of sanctions? And how can, if this is something that is so, if this is a system that is so robust and that has been in place for so many years, how can it be circumvented, and what are the tools and methods used?
There are some I would say activities that are more rewarding than others if I'm trying to evade sanctions.
Yeah, of course.
It also depends on the kind of, of regime that we're talking about. There are some regimes that that people are going to pay a little bit more of attention. So for instance, right now, Russia is definitely in everybody's mind. So we know we are in London today. So the Combating Kleptocracy Cell is a specific unit that spends literally all day, all night researching cases of sanction evasion. So you know that some regimes are going to be, or at least they're going to try to enforce them a little bit more. So actually, talking about corruption, talking about tracing the assets and all these kind of things, John Christensen, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but
Yes, of
he
course.
is probably the best person you should talk to because he's a massive expert on that.
How have you been, John?
Yeah, good. Busy.
It's good to hear.
London in the autumn, always busy.
Yes, it's the start of projects, isn't it?
Yep.
You were telling me actually earlier how it's a very exciting time in the autumn. So during the research on Middlemen, I was really surprised at how complicated sanctions and evasion and circumvention tools and methods were. And they keep evolving since World War II when they were first established. For anyone who would like to understand more about sanction circumvention tools and methods, can we outline what they are and briefly explain how they work?
And the first thing I'd say is that complexity you talk about is by design. Because complexity is another form of secrecy. If you make something so complex that anyone looking at it, any investigator looking at it, reaches the stage where there's a term they use in America called MIGO, my eyes glaze over. It's all so complicated, I really don't understand what's going on. That is not by accident. It's designed into it because what you're trying to achieve through the various legal mechanisms, the shell companies and the offshore trusts and the secret bank accounts, what you're trying to achieve there is to do principally two things. First of all, hide the identities of the perpetrators, of the people who are setting up the sanction busting regime. And secrecy is key to that, obviously. If you're trying to keep identities secret, you need to use offshore shell companies, offshore trusts, offshore foundations. You need to have nominee directors and a whole host of other tools which make it really difficult. And as you say, over the decades, 1950s, 1960s, these things evolved because people needed to become even more calculated in the way they introduced complexity. It was no longer a case of just using one offshore place like the British Virgin Islands. If you're trading, a lot of sanctions busting was originally principally commodities, minerals, oils and so on. The more jurisdictions, the more complexity you can get into it, the harder it becomes for the people who are policing sanctions to find out the identity of the people who are doing it. And the easier it becomes for the sanctions busters to hide or disguise the nature of the transactions they're involved in.
There are multiple ways in which you can evade sanctions. There are the most obvious ones, such as creating, offshore companies, creating anonymous trusts or shell companies as well. So layering up, for instance, the kind of structures, so that the more complex, the more difficult it is to trace the money. You can, rely on trade-based money laundering, which has to do a lot with the kind of shipments and the invoices. You can say, that there is more of an item than what actually is being transported. Crypto is lately being one of the, ways which are being used more commonly by, for instance, North Korean hackers for evading sanctions, or just any high value item can be used to store value, and as a result you have art, you have diamonds, you have designer bags, luxury items, anything that is related, that can be transported but is also very, very expensive. That's a great way to transfer your money, to store it there and then moving it around.
I think it's interesting that middlemen, or the majority of intermediaries, they choose to conceal their identities. They choose to conceal their faces from the media and from the spotlight or any form of limelight. But
Is this important?
Oh yes, very important indeed, because in many cases they are breaking international laws, and they are fugitive from justice, particularly U.S. justice. So they are extremely elusive. They're quite prepared to disappear from the face of the earth. I mean, if you want to have a close look at one such individual, take a look at this guy.